The question answered by a unanimous Supreme Court was about asylum and the word persecution. When the facts aren't in dispute, who gets the last word on whether those facts add up to persecution under the immigration law, the immigration agency, or the federal appeals court? The court said the Immigration and Nationality Act requires appeals courts to use a substantial evidence standard when reviewing the Board of Immigration Appeals on that point. In other words, the appeals court must defer not only to the agency's fact findings, but also to the agency's application of the persecution standard to those facts. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson writes for the court affirming the First Circuit, which had upheld the agency's denial of the petitioner's asylum applications. After the break, we'll dig into why that standard of review matters so much when someone is asking for asylum. Nine Robes uses nonpartisan, everyday language to focus on the facts of what the Supreme Court is saying. Here, you'll find clear, concise summaries of every Supreme Court opinion, stripped of legalese and clickbait headlines. Each post breaks down the facts, explains the court's reasoning, and highlights the crucial details that often go unnoticed. It's not just about what the court decided. It's about why those decisions matter, to give you a deeper understanding of the cases that define our nation's legal landscape. These summaries are generated by AI. Be careful and consult reputable sources when in doubt. Douglas Humberto Urias-Orellana and his family fled El Salvador and came to the United States seeking asylum. They had been targeted by a hitman for years. When they appeared before an immigration judge, they told their story. Death threats, a shooting that killed two of Douglas's half-brothers, having to move repeatedly to escape danger, and constant intimidation. The judge believed every single word they said. The judge found their testimony completely credible. But here's where things get complicated. Even though the judge believed everything the family said was true, the judge still denied their asylum claim. The reason? The judge decided that what happened to them, while terrible, didn't legally count as persecution under federal immigration law. Think about that for a moment. The facts weren't in dispute. The judge believed the family. But the judge concluded that these true facts didn't meet the legal definition of persecution. The family appealed, arguing that once everyone agrees on the facts and the testimony is credible, federal appeals courts should be able to independently decide whether those facts meet the legal definition of persecution. The First Circuit Court of Appeals disagreed and upheld the denial. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case because different federal appeals courts around the country had been answering this question differently. Nicholas Rossellini represented the Urias-Orellana family. He argued that persecution is a specialized legal term that comes from international refugee law. It's not just an ordinary word that anyone can define. Unlike everyday terms that judges deal with all the time, persecution requires specialized legal interpretation. The immigration statute says that courts should defer only to findings of fact. Once the facts are undisputed and everyone agrees the testimony is credible, deciding whether those facts constitute persecution becomes a purely legal question. And legal questions, Rossellini argued, should get fresh review by appeals courts without any deference to the immigration judge's conclusion. Rossellini compared this to copyright law. When courts decide whether something is fair use under copyright law, they independently review whether undisputed facts satisfy the fair use standard, even though that analysis involves looking at lots of specific facts. He also pointed out that the Board of Immigration Appeals, the administrative body that reviews immigration judge decisions, reviews persecution determinations with fresh eyes internally. This suggests, he argued, that even the agency itself recognizes this as fundamentally a legal question rather than a factual one. Joshua dos Santos represented the government. He argued that the persecution determination is primarily about facts, even though it has legal components. Applying the persecution standard to specific facts requires weighing evidence, drawing inferences about the totality of circumstances, and evaluating patterns over time. These are all classic fact-finding tasks. Immigration judges and the Board of Immigration Appeals have reviewed thousands of these cases over the years. they've developed superior judgment about what constitutes persecution. Most importantly, Dos Santos emphasized the historical context. Back in 1992, the Supreme Court decided a case called INS v. Elias-Zacharias. That case established that persecution determinations get deferential review, meaning appeals courts should give significant weight to what immigration judges decide. Congress knew about this decision. In 1996, Congress passed a major immigration reform law called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. The language Congress used in that law tracked the language from Elias-Zacharias. The overall thrust of that 1996 law was to restrict judicial review throughout immigration law. Given that context, Dos Santos argued, it would be inconsistent with what Congress intended to allow fresh, independent review of persecution determinations. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote an opinion that all 9 justices supported unanimously. The court upheld a lower court's decision and clarified how courts should review asylum cases. Under federal law, courts must defer to immigration judges' factual findings unless no reasonable decision-maker would reach the same conclusion. The court ruled that this standard applies to the entire asylum determination, both the facts and how those facts are legally analyzed. Jackson based her decision on 2 foundations: prior Supreme Court precedent and the original intent of Congress. A 1992 case established this exact standard, even if it didn't use the phrase substantial evidence. Jackson invoked a principle called the aware legislator canon, the idea that Congress knows about Supreme Court decisions when it passes new laws. When Congress rewrote immigration law in 1996 using similar language, it signaled that it meant to adopt the same approach, not change it. Jackson tackled a key objection directly. Asylum decisions involve legal judgment, not just facts. But she explained that asylum determinations are fundamentally factual. Immigration judges assess whether witnesses are credible, evaluate testimony, and weigh evidence about conditions in other countries. Credibility is itself a factual finding that courts should respect. It would make no sense, Jackson wrote, to defer to the factual findings while independently second-guessing whether those facts satisfy a legal standard. The asylum determination requires judges to make crucial factual assessments about each applicant's actual experiences. Jackson also distinguished 2 other recent cases the family cited. Those cases dealt with whether courts can hear cases at all. This case is about how closely courts examine decisions they do review. These are separate questions, and one doesn't determine the other. This distinction was central to Jackson's reasoning. The decision resolves disagreement among federal appeals courts, but leaves some boundaries unclear. Courts must defer to immigration judges' decisions on asylum cases in their entirety. These courts decide both the facts and whether those facts meet the legal standard for persecution. It codifies what courts were already doing. Justice Jackson treated the 1996 immigration law as maintaining that earlier practice, reflecting respect for continuity. There's an important exception. Pure challenges to the persecution standard itself get independent review. But the line between these facts don't satisfy your standard and your standard is wrong blurs in practice, and courts will struggle to draw it consistently. The decision prioritizes agency expertise over independent judicial development of law. Rather than letting courts build sophisticated legal principles through reviewing cases, as they do in tort law, Jackson deferred to Congress's judgment about agency authority. When statutes set review standards, courts enforce them even if other arrangements might seem better. The opinion relies on the aware legislator canon. This canon assumes Congress knows about Supreme Court precedent when passing laws. When Congress reused similar language in 1996, it signals intent to maintain the earlier approach. But Congress often reuses language for convenience without fully considering its implications, so this assumption risks reading false precision into legislative intent. Find us online at 9robes.ai. That's the number 9robes.ai. Like and share this podcast with friends that like to be informed. 9 Robes provides AI summaries of U.S. Supreme Court cases. AI makes mistakes. People make mistakes too. We genuinely do our best to provide you with the most accurate summaries, but our best sometimes includes errors.